I guess we're gonna have to do what we can do here. I don't know. Let's see if I can get you guys a better angle on the screen there. At least. Not a lot better, but a little better. Yeah, that's not working. Okay. Bigger desk, I guess. So now, the problem there is I'm not going to be able to see any of you guys' comments, so, just bear with me on that. Maybe. Try a different route here. Just you guys in here. Nope. All right, well. Well then, guys, I don't know. Read some stories from my new book. How does that sound to you guys? Shit. Give you guys a few minutes to get in here. If you guys don't have your copy of Bleak Vistas yet, by the way, there's a link in most of my videos, so just go down and have a look. You can get it on Amazon. I really need to get around to making a website, but I'm lazy. Also, if any of you guys are patrons, I put all of my patrons on the dedication page, so, if you'd like to be a patron, get in all my books. So, for those of you just joining us, yeah, we couldn't make game streaming work. I'm gonna have to do a little more research on that. So we're just reading stories. Let's see. What should we read? What's it called? I like The Man Who Lived in the Hollow Oak Tree, so I guess we'll read that. None of us believed him. How could we? It was just so odd that it couldn't be true. I swear to you that it happened. I can't prove it, but I swear it happened. We all just kind of shook our heads, but the look on Roger's face should have been proof enough that he was serious. He looked haunted, like the sight would never leave him. Roger was a habitual drunk. He managed it well for work, but he'd been drunk since I met him in college. He's a social drinker and kind of a fun drunk. He's not a social drinker or a fun drunk, but a hardcore alcoholic. Like I said, he keeps it under control so he can hold down a job. But for from quitting time till he passes out, Roger is drunk, and usually in his own little world. The story he told us happened in the park last night, and how he told it made me think he might be stone sober while he told it. Roger'd been off that day, so he'd headed to McGrady's at 11, just as the other drunks were starting to stagger up. He'd drunk his lunch, met us for shots after Ryan and I had gotten off of work, and left about 8 when the bartender told him to stop smacking the jukebox or to get the hell out. Roger, very drunk at this point, had staggered out and gone to the park across the way. He intended to sit for a minute and wait for his head to stop spinning long enough to pick up a fresh bottle and start drinking on the way home. I was sitting there on the bench near the little pond, across from the hollow oak tree. I nodded, knowing just what he was talking about. The hollow oak is kind of a landmark in our town. Guy from the agricultural college tested it a few years ago and determined it was 80% hollow inside. They were at a loss to say how it had stayed on the ground, but it did, and people sometimes came up to take pictures. The city had set up a chain perimeter around it, and you weren't supposed to touch it or disturb it in any way. So I'm sitting there, watching the sun go down, and night begins to settle when I see this guy come out of the tree. We had asked if he meant someone was sleeping at the top of the tree or at the base of the tree, but Roger just shook his head and repeated that the guy had been inside the tree. If you're just joining us, we're actually reading a little. I couldn't get the game to work, so join us. Come sit. We'll read some stories. It's like, he had floundered for words. Remember when you were a kid and you played with Play-Doh? You had that thing that would squeeze the dough through a little hole and mush it like spaghetti. Well, it was kind of like that, except so much worse. He said it had started with an arm. Roger had thought it might be a squirrel or a bird, but when the fingers gripped the bark, he began to think he might be hallucinating. The arm pulled itself out and turned, and then a head followed. Roger said he almost screamed. He was certain he was hallucinating now, sure that the sauce had finally cooked his brain, but he doubted even his mind could create something like this. The tree pushed the person out, head, shoulders, knees, and toes, and the man hit the ground on all fours like a spider. He scuttled across the grass under the chain, and when he got to the edge of the barrier, he started making gagging noises. As Roger watched, the man had thrown up a dozen small somethings and then scuttled to the other corner of the barricade to do it again. He had done this 3 more times, upchucking into the earth, and when he looked up from all fours, he made eye contact with Roger. The man's face, he said, had been confused, but not afraid. He was looking at something unfamiliar, and when he smiled, Roger felt his breath catch in his throat. The man's teeth were pointed like a bunch of sewing needles, and the look had been far bigger than Roger's pickled brain could understand. The smile looked painful, too big, like he could have swallowed me whole. Roger had run then, ran all the way home. And that's where we found him last night, passed out on the floor and mumbling in his sleep. I finished my cup of coffee and told Roger he'd best get ready if he wanted to ride to work, but Roger said he wasn't going in today. He told me to tell the boss he didn't feel well, and I told him that I'd come see him at McGrady's after work. He'd shaken his head at me, mumbling how he'd never go back to the bar again. I think I might be done with the sauce for a while. I rolled my eyes and left for work, expecting to find him drunk when I got to the bar that night. However, when I got to the bar at 6 o'clock, he was nowhere to be seen. Bartender said he hadn't seen him all day, but asked me to remind him that his tab still needed settling. I asked a few of the regulars, and they said they hadn't seen him either. So I stepped out of McGrady's and found a familiar shape sitting in the park. I walked up to him and found him stone sober, as he sat on the same bench he had told me about the day before. "Have you been here all day?" I asked Roger, just nodding as he stared at the tree. If you guys are just joining us, we're reading some stories, so come on, sit down, take a load off. I'd never seen Roger this way, and it kind of scared me. I'd seen him sober before, and I'd seen him drunk plenty of times, but this was different. He was like a different person, someone who's seen something he can't comprehend, and I felt sorry for the tumult that must be going on inside his head. You were serious about the creature, weren't you? I asked. Roger nodded, his eyes boring into the tree like he meant to melt it. I wanted to walk away, but I found myself sitting beside him instead. My morbid curiosity had gotten the better of me, and if this creature was real, I wanted to see it too. We sat like watchers in a theater, waiting for the show to begin. It wasn't a short sit either. 6 became 7, became 8, and we watched the sun sink lower and lower as 8 became 8:30. It was high summer and the days were long. Just before 8:30, the sun began its burning coal on the horizon, and the two of us tensed for what might or might not be about to happen. As the darkness settled over us, I sighed. Good one, Roger. Got me to waste my whole afternoon on this nonsense. Come on, I'll buy you a drink, and you can have a good laugh at how... But he grabbed my arm and pointed at the tree with a shaky hand. I looked back as a long pink worm squirmed its way out of a knothole. It's just a worm, Roger. You got drunk and hallucinated something that scared you. I'm glad you're using it as an excuse to get sober, but don't ask me to buy into your delusion. Does that look like a worm to you? He asked, his voice shaking. I glanced back and saw that it no longer resembled a worm. The worm had become 5, and they were attached to a pale pink hand. The hand had unfurled from the hole like some alien flower, and as the wrist made its way out, I realized that the show had begun. The wrist emerged, and behind it came an arm and an elbow. The shoulder was next, and as the tree sprouted a man, I found myself unable to look away. He came slithering from the knothole, this boneless creature in human flesh. It was like watching dough being pushed through a press, and I wondered how it could possibly do this. If you're just joining us, we're reading some stories. I couldn't get the games to play satisfactory, so sit down for a minute, take a load off. We're going to read some stories out of my new book, Bleak Vistas. When the head came free, it looked like nothing so much as a helium balloon being inflated. How? I gibbered, my mind refusing to understand what it was seeing. How can this be? If Roger knew, he never answered. The two of us sat mesmerized as we watched the full-grown man come slithering from a gnarled opening too small for a squirrel to fit into. He hung from the opening when it was down to the legs, a caterpillar ready to slide from its cocoon. He hit the ground on his back before flipping over gracefully and scuttling on all fours towards the little chain fence. When he opened his mouth, a spray of small something spilled onto the ground. They were black, looking like smooth river stones you sometimes buy at a hobby shop. He threw up about 20 of them before scuttling to the other corner. He repeated the operation 4 more times as he opened his mouth for the 4th one. I saw the double row of pointed teeth in his oddly large mouth when he did. He looked up after seeing us, and just as Roger said, he smiled before scuttling back to the tree and pressing himself back into the hole. It was like watching a blow-up doll deflate in slow motion. First his arms, then his shoulders, then his head, then his legs, and before long his feet disappeared grotesquely into the cramped little opening. By the time he was done, it was almost 9, and I felt as though my brain had been awake for days. That probably sounds weird, but when you see something like that, something that just doesn't make sense, your brain tries its best to make it fit into the picture of the world you know. Birds fly, fish swim. This man compressed himself in and out of a tree so that he could throw up. I stood up then, but Roger grabbed my arm. Don't do it. If you look, you won't be able to stop yourself. I pulled myself away from him, wanting to see what it was. I needed to know. Why did he come out to throw them up? Were they bugs that he'd killed in this tree? Were they some kind of sickness that he had to keep purging? Why did this thing that defied logic come out of its tree just to throw up these whatever they were. I bent down, taking out my phone, and shone a light on the pile closest to us. I gasped. I couldn't help myself. They were acorns. Solid black acorns that were about twice the size of normal acorns. I reached down to pick one up, but my hand froze before I could touch it. I stood up, wiping my hand, despite it having touched nothing, and offered to buy Roger a drink anyway. After what we'd seen, we probably needed one. "No thanks," he said. "I think I'm done drinking for a while. Maybe you ought to come home too." We ended up heading home and just watching TV for the rest of the night. Roger hasn't had a drop of alcohol in a month, and I still dream about that strange creature once or twice a week. It will fade in time, but I want to get it down here so others know. Given what happened yesterday, it's information that people might need. You see, the news reported that the hollow oak was gone. No one had seen it go, but the patrons of McGrady's had speculated that it must have been between midnight and 5 a.m. when the bar closed. Many of them had seen that old tree when they came inside, but reported that it was gone when they left at 5 a.m. The ones who could remember, at least. But never fear, local botanists have reported that a small sapling has already sprouted in the spot that its predecessor occupied. There is no evidence to suggest that it might also be a hollow oak, but this reporter certainly hopes so. I'd like to say that this was where it ended, but unfortunately there's a little more. You see, I couldn't get those strange acorns out of my head. I kept thinking about them, wondering about them, so the night before the hollow oak left, I went and watched the man as he went about his strange and disgusting ritual. Once he had gone back inside the tree, I went to the pile to take one. I put it in my jacket pocket, and now it's sitting on my desk. It seems to draw my eye. The little acorn almost appeared to beat like an infected heart, and my mind tells me to plant it in the ground. Roger told me that if I touch it, I wouldn't be able to help myself, and he was right. I don't know how much longer I can stop myself from planting it, but I fear what might come tumbling out of it one night if it grows. So if the hollow oak lands in your town, don't touch its strange occupant's acorns when he comes to deposit them. I wouldn't interrupt his strange ritual either, not if I were you. The occupant seems harmless, but all those teeth must be for eating something. I hope you guys enjoyed that one. It's from Bleak Vistas. That's my new book. You can find a link on my profile. Just came out a couple of weeks ago. Let's see. This is a good one. It's The Gray of Sunset. It happened when I was on my way home from the flea market. I sell things I make out of junk. The term is trash sculptures in the community I belong to, but I never liked that term. Some may call them junk, but to me, they're treasures. I make all kinds of things from stuff I find at the dump. They sell pretty well, but not in my home state. I usually end up driving to Sadie's Flea Market, one of those sprawling outdoor markets in Alabama, to sell my wares. The people there love them, and today was the first time in a while I've come home with anything. I had sold a few small sculptures today, but no one seemed to want the larger piece I'd brought. So I found myself loading the sitter into the back of my truck as the sun went down and the market closed for the day. I'd made him out of rebar and old license plates, and he was definitely unique looking. I had some lookers, but he was a little heavy for my usual crowd. The sitter is an end-of-the-day purchase, so to be sure, and no one was buying him today. I sat him in the back of the truck and grinned as he looked like he was resting in the truck bed after a long day of being on display. With my passenger secured, I cleared up the stall and rolled out of the parking lot just as it started getting dark. The road was busy, but not overly so. It's about an hour to my house through some pretty rural countryside. I never minded. It's a soothing view as you roll along towards the Florida-Alabama line. Most of the route is roadside stands, abandoned buildings, gas stations, the ever-popular fireworks stand. It's hard to explain, but it always seems so desolate out here. a single pole light shining outside the shell of an abandoned house, an old store that's slowly being retaken by the woods, a rotting cooler that someone just left by the roadside, its mouth wide open and its insides on display. They were little things that remind me that humanity had once had hope for these out of the way places. It made me wish I had some skill with a camera. What's up, Matt? Thanks for stopping by. Have a seat. Have some story. Let's see. Some artistic types would probably have paid a mint for pictures of some of these things. As I drove, I saw other people getting ready to leave the shops and businesses along the highway. The setting sun seemed to wash them out in a way that was hard to explain. It's strange, but the sunset grayed them, making them look like actors in an early 90s show. It seemed to bleed all the color out of them, and it's kind of nostalgic for me. It always seemed comfortable, till today. Hey, Kelly, have a seat. You can indeed. It's Bleak Vistas on Amazon. Jay Campbell is my name. You should be able to look it up with Bleak Vistas, though, honestly. Oh, I understand, man. It's only 9 o'clock here, so I got at it a little early tonight. Oh, alright, let's get back to it. As I drove for the state line, the sun turned the trees into a fiery corona, a forest fire that burned on until it was snuffed out with the eventual setting of the sun. It started rather subtly. I had chalked it up to the sun, having gone down when I first noticed it, but as I drove past a familiar barn, I had to double take. The barn was probably older than me, but it looked like something done on a sketchbook. It was hard to put into words, but it looked flat and unfinished. As I watched, the light on the barn threw only a small circle of illumination, and the yard looked grainy and unreal. I watched as a cat walked under the light, looking unfinished. He looked like a graphite line that's learned to move independently. I rubbed my eyes as I rolled along, pretty sure I was just tired. I'd been making sculptures and putting together today's pieces all week, and I was probably just starting to feel the strain. A little sleep was all I needed, and once I got home, I could start burning my candle at both ends again. The sitter would sit in my truck until I woke up tomorrow morning, and I'd add another 2 or 3 pieces to the truck bed before next Saturday. I didn't think much of it and rolled along until I saw the other houses. The farther I drove, the harder it was to ignore the strange change in the landscape. I drove past the trailer park and was almost moved to stop and observe it. I could see all the gray lead outlines on the houses, each set in a stark gray and black, and the windows glowed moodily with secret knowledge. The insides looked like they were lit by bug zappers. Excuse me. That harsh fluorescent light making them seem to crackle. The porch lights on the front of them made the concrete look porous, almost holy, and I wondered if the out front and I wondered if the dog out front would ejaculate only a word bubble from his mouth that said bark if I should try. It was all very unreal, and I had to look down at my own hands to discover whether I too looked like a pencil sketch. I was pleased to find my average level of realness and just kept driving as I tried to get past whatever I'd driven into. It didn't get bad until I came to the stoplight. I do need to do that. You are correct, man. Under the end part of that, though, there are links to things. If any of you guys are curious about my Reddit or like some of my Amazon stuff, there's definitely some links there that you can follow. Where were we? There's only one light before you get to the state line. It's probably there to allow people leaving the gas station or the liquor store to get back onto the highway so they don't get creamed. The gas station had only a single light on over the pumps, but the inside looked welcoming. It reminded me of that painting, the one with the dead celebrities in the diner. I was half tempted to turn in when something whooshed to life on my left. I turned to see a fire on the side of the liquor store and strange shapes that crouched around it. It wasn't much more than a one-room building that sold beer and wine. I'd driven past the pink stucco building 1,000 times, but it had an evil look tonight. It didn't glow like the trailer or the gas station, and its face was dark and brooding as the glass reflected the fire on the side of it. It seemed the antithesis of the gas station, and sitting across the street from each other, they almost seemed adversarial. The cars in the parking lot were old, rusty sorts, pickups and dark colored Cadillacs, the long, cigar shaped constructs. They seemed to hunch around like gargoyles, but as the fire began to build, I saw strange figures feeding it. The store had a cage behind it, something the employees filled with cardboard boxes and trash, and then burned them when it was full. I watched as the human shaped creatures threw boxes onto the flames, others simply standing around as they watched the fire in exultation. The people weren't even approximations of people. They looked like a child's idea of a human shape. The bodies bulbous and the heads lumpy. Their arms were muscled, their legs disproportionately squat. They looked like orcs from a Tolkien book, and just looking at them made me a little uneasy. They were supposed to be humans, but I'd never seen anything less human in my life. They looked like natives in an old jungle picture, dancing around a flaming idol. As I sat there watching them, I saw one of them notice me. I glanced back at the light, but it was hard to tell what color it was. All three of them were shades of gray, and as they flicked through, I couldn't tell what I was supposed to do. Something moved before the grainy flame, returning my attention to the liquor store. The four of them froze as they saw I had noticed them, their red eyes glaring as they prepared to run up on the truck. Red or green, I didn't care. I put my foot on the gas and blew through the intersection, rolling up the road as the four lumpy humanoids watched me. My tires squealed as I flew up the blacktop. The trees and buildings we passed had begun to pulsate a little, their lead edges crackling like lightning. The whole thing looked like a Tex Avery cartoon, something from a sketchbook nightmare skit from the old show, and the longer I watched the sky, the less I cared for the road. Excuse me. My eyes were glued to that fuzzy space, the graphite lightning sending phosphorescent clarity through the steely gray sky. Something was rising amongst the clouds, a silver orb of a moon that suddenly and unexpectedly filled me with fear. Then it rolled in the sky, and I was suddenly looking at the eye of some giant beast. It swam in that inky space, the perfect orb, and when it found me, I began to shake. The eye looked straight at me, fixing me with its gaze, not blinking as its regard bore into me, and I found myself unable to look away. When the harsh lights and equally jarring horn invaded my space, I continued to be aware of nothing but that unblinking moon. Sorry. Then suddenly everything went dark, and I was left floating in the inky blackness until a beeping brought me back to the waking world. I was in a hospital, arms aching from the IV and head pounding from the wound that had likely landed me here. My sister had been playing on her phone, but she looked up when I started groaning back to consciousness. She stopped me from getting up, and I realized I only saw her out of one eye. Thankfully, the other was just covered with bandages, but it was pretty jarring at the time. My sister filled me in and said that she was glad I had come out because no one understood what had happened. According to the man in the moving truck, the one I had scared half to death, I'd crossed into his lane as he drove back to the depot. He had swerved, barely avoiding my truck as I left the road, and he saw something slip out of the back and fall onto the concrete. I had proceeded into the nearby woods before a tree stopped my progress. It wasn't until he went to check on my passenger that he realized it was a dented metal doll and went to check on me. He helped me get out of the truck and stayed with me until the ambulance came. I had spent 4 days in a coma after that. I didn't know what had happened. I can't really explain it, but somehow I slipped into something very different. The road I'd come to know was not what I drove that night, and I suddenly found myself in a place I couldn't understand. I tried to tell people that but they didn't. But they seemed to believe I might have been drugged or had picked up something. I couldn't handle at the flea market. They never found anything heavier than Xanax in my system, though. My sister had floated the idea that I had fallen asleep and had a dream before I drove off the road. I told her maybe, but I knew what I had seen. I saw those things, and I'm lucky to have escaped them. So if you're driving the highways of America, be on the lookout for pockets of strangeness. And good luck if you should slip into one of them. Alrighty, guys. I've got another video coming out tonight. It's some gameplay footage. It was a game I meant to play tonight. I can't get the streaming software to play right. I think we're going to call it there probably. I hope you guys enjoyed some stories. If you did, let me know. I should probably do more of these, but I don't know. Who's got time, right, with writing? Come back next time and I'll read some more stories. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening. Oh, well, thank you. I've got a compilation on there for tonight. So, maybe listen to some of those. It's got some good stories on there. All right, guys. See you later.